Chapter 33. The Big Economic Picture. Population Growth and Living Standards in MDCs. No one today can deny that the United States has the grossest national production in the world. Paul Ehrlich, quoted in Goodall 1975. We've already had too much economic growth in the United States. Economic growth in rich countries like ours is the disease, not the cure. Paul Ehrlich, quoted in Ray 1990. The most interesting thing to observe is the complete lack of imagination which the vision of Malthus, Mill, and Ricardo reveals. Those writers lived at the threshold of the most spectacular economic developments ever witnessed. Vast possibilities matured into realities under their very eyes. Nevertheless, they saw nothing but cramped economies struggling with ever-decreasing success for their daily bread. They were convinced that technological improvement and increase in capital would in the end fail to counteract the fateful law of decreasing returns. James Mill, in his Elements, even offered a proof for this. In other words, they were all stagnationists, or, to use their own term, they all expected for the future the advent of a stationary state. Joseph A. Schumpeter, History of Economic Analysis, 1954. The Malthusian theory of population growth, accepted until the 1980s by most economists and by the public accepted still, says one thing. The data say something else entirely. This chapter discusses the theory, presents the facts, and then reconciles fact and expanded theory for the more developed countries, MDCs. Chapter 34 does the same for the less developed countries, LDCs. This chapter and the next are tougher reading than most of the others, but I hope you will bear with them. Read them when your mind is fresh, perhaps. The theory of population and income. Classical economic theory apparently shows irrefutably that population growth must reduce the standard of living. The heart of all economic theory of population from Malthus to the limits to growth can be stated in a single sentence. The more people using a stock of resources, the lower the income per person, all else equal. This proposition derives from the law of diminishing returns. Two people cannot use the same tool at the same time or farm the same piece of land without reducing the output per worker. A related idea is that two people cannot nourish themselves as well as one person from a given stock of food. And when one considers the age distribution resulting from a higher birth rate, the effect is reinforced by a larger proportion of children and thus a lower proportion of workers in the larger population. Let us spell out these Malthusian ideas. The consumption effect. Simply adding more people to a population affects consumption directly. If there is only one pie, the pieces will be smaller if it is divided among more eaters. The experience of hippies in San Francisco in 1967 illustrates this problem amusingly. Most hippies take the question of survival for granted, but it's becoming increasingly obvious as the neighborhood fills with penniless heads that there is simply not enough food and lodging to go around. A partial solution may come from a group called the Diggers, who have been called the worker priests of the hippie movement and the invisible government of the hashberry. The Diggers are young and aggressively pragmatic. They have set up free lodging centers, free soup kitchens, and free clothing distribution centers. They comb the neighborhood, soliciting donations of everything from money to stale bread to camping equipment. For a while, the Diggers were able to serve 3 meals, however meager, each afternoon in Golden Gate Park. But as the word got around, more and more hippies showed up to eat, and the Diggers were forced to roam far afield to get food. Occasionally there were problems, as when Digger chieftain Emmett Grogan, 23, called a local butcher a fascist pig and a coward when he refused to donate meat scraps. The butcher whacked Grogan with the flat side of his meat cleaver. This consumption effect occurs most sharply within a family. When there are more children, each one gets a smaller part of the family's earnings, if earnings remain the same. We see the effect in Thomas Hardy's Mayor of Casterbridge. True, your mother was a very good woman. I can mind her. She were rewarded by the Agricultural Society for having begot the greatest number of healthy children without parish assistance, and other virtuous marvels. 'Twas that kept us so low upon ground, that great hungry family. A. Where the pigs be many, the wash runs thin. The production effect. Adding people also affects consumption indirectly through the effect on production per worker. Consider a country that at a given time possesses a given amount of land and a given quantity of factories and other industrial capital. If the country comes to have a larger labor force, production per worker will be lower because each worker comes to have, on the average, less land or tools to work with. Hence, average production per worker will be lower with a larger labor force and fixed capital. This is the classical argument of diminishing returns. The public facilities effect. If a given population is instantly enlarged by, say, 10% in all age groups, there will be 10% more people wanting to use the village well, or the city hospital, or the public beach. An increase in the demand for such freely provided public services inevitably results in an increase in the number of people who are denied service, a decrease in the amount of service per person, or an additional expenditure by the government to increase the amount of public facilities. If the 10% population increase also results in a 10% increase in the number of people working, and if the productivity of the added people is as great on the average as that of the original population, then the added population will have no effect on per capita income. But such a compensating increase in production is not likely. If more children are born, the demand for public facilities, especially schools, will occur before the children grow up, find work, and become productive. And even immigrating adults use at least the custom house before starting work. And after the additional children join the labor force, they are likely to lower the average worker's productivity at first because of the law of diminishing returns discussed earlier, and hence the added workers will not be able to contribute as much in taxes to support public facilities as the average person formerly did. These effects were discussed in Chapter 25, as were the data that called into question these theoretical propositions. As a result of the increased demand, the average level of public services received is likely to be lower. The average person will receive less education and less health care than if the population remains fixed. And some tax monies that might have gone into harbors or communication systems may go instead to the education and health care of the added people. In classical theory, then, sheer numbers of people depress per capita income in two ways. More consumers divide any given amount of output, and each worker produces less because there is less capital, private and public, per worker. Age distribution effects. As we saw in Chapter 23, a faster-growing population implies a larger proportion of children, which means that a larger proportion of the population is too young to work. The smaller proportion of workers must mean a smaller output per capita, all else equal. Therefore, the effect of sheer numbers of people and the age distribution that occurs in the process of getting to the higher numbers both work in the same direction, causing a smaller per capita product. When one also takes women's labor into account, the effect of having a higher proportion of children is even greater. The more children that are born per woman, the less chance she has to work outside the home. For example, in the 1920s and 1930s, when most Israeli kibbutzim were near bare subsistence, strong pressure was often brought upon couples not to have more than 2 children in order to enable women to do more productive work. And the same is true in China now. But in the US, at least, this effect is not as great as one might expect. Calculations show that each baby after the first keeps an average woman out the labor force for only about half a year. There is a counterbalancing effect from the father's work. A wide variety of studies show that an additional child causes fathers to work additional hours, the equivalent of 2 to 6 extra weeks of work a year. In the long run, this yearly 4 to 10% increase in work for an additional child may fully, or more than fully, balance the temporary loss of labor force time by the mother. One might say that an additional child forces a father to work, which might be called a bad outcome. But if he chooses to have the additional child at the cost of working more, it is reasonable to say that he prefers that alternative of having more children and more work to fewer children and less work. This is quite the same as working more hours to have a nicer home or to pay for additional education. Who is to say which choice is bad or wrong? Age distribution affects income distribution too. In the discussion of Social Security and saving in Chapter 23, we saw that a larger proportion of younger persons implies that more earners will one day support each retired person, which means a better pension for each retired person and a smaller burden on each working-age person. Other theoretical effects. The dilution of capital through reduced saving and through reduced education per person are other elements of the standard economic theory of population growth, though chapters 25 and 27 show them to be far smaller drawbacks than commonly thought, and perhaps no drawback at all. The only positive theoretical effect is that of larger markets and larger scale production, known to economists as economies of scale or of scope, which chapter 27 discussed. The evidence versus the Malthusian theory. The Malthusian supply side effect of diminishing output from additional workers and the demand side effect of less to go around among a larger number of consumers have until the 1980s dominated the conventional economic theory of population growth. And the implication is clear. Additional people must reduce the standard of living, all else equal. But a very solid body of evidence does not confirm that body of theory. The data suggests that population growth almost certainly does not hinder and perhaps aids economic growth. One piece of historical evidence is the concurrent explosion of both population and economic development in Europe from 1650 onward, a positive rather than negative association. Other benign evidence is found in the rates of population growth and output per capita, as compared in Figure 33.1, which includes contemporary MDCs for which data is available for the past century. No strong relationship appears. Such studies can go wrong unless they are done with competence. Therefore, it is relevant that the first such study was done by Simon Kuznets, who won a Nobel Prize for his work with economic data, and who is widely regarded as the greatest economic demographic historian of the last few centuries. Studies of the more recent rates of population growth and economic growth are another source of evidence. Many comparisons have by now been made among various countries, MDCs and LDCs, by almost a score of skilled researchers using a variety of methods, and there is agreement among them that population growth does not hinder economic growth. These overlapping empirical studies do not show that fast population growth increases per capita income, but they certainly imply that population growth does not decrease economic growth. To bolster these aggregate data on the overall relationship between population growth and economic growth, there have also been many studies of the relevant elements of the economy: education, savings, investment, and the like. These studies amplify and strengthen the conclusion drawn from the aggregate data that population growth is not a drag on development. These data, which contradict the simple Malthusian theory, have naturally evoked explanations. One such explanation is that population growth is a challenge that evokes the response of increased efforts from individuals and societies. There certainly is evidence that people make special efforts when they perceive a special need. This is seen in the second jobs, more hours of work, and other adjustments people make when they have relatively many children. I summarize much of this evidence in my 1986 book on effort. Another reason why population growth does not retard economic growth is that a high proportion of youths in the labor force has advantages. 1. A younger worker produces relatively more than she or he consumes, in contrast to an older worker, largely because of increases in pay with seniority, whether or not there is increased productivity with seniority. 2. Each generation enters the labor force with more education than the previous generation. Hence, a larger proportion of youth implies an increase in the average education of the labor force, all else being equal. Younger workers save a larger proportion of their income than do older workers. Furthermore, population growth creates additional opportunities and facilitates adaptive changes in the economic and social structures of MDCs in several ways. 1. A necessary reduction in the size of an organization or workforce is always painful. But when the population and the economy are growing, a facility or workforce that needs reduction can be reduced in relative size by leaving it the same absolute size, which is less painful. 2. Cessation of population growth makes it more difficult to staff new departments to adjust to changing conditions. In universities, for example, when there is an overall growth in enrollments, new fields can be staffed by new faculty without cutting back on existing faculty. When there is no overall growth, new fields cannot be staffed without fighting the entrenched faculty who do not wish to give up the positions they hold. Cessation of growth also means that there are fewer new appointments to be made overall. In American and European universities since the 1970s, this lack of growth has struck particularly hard at the numbers of young professors who can be appointed, which has been demoralizing to aspirants for the PhD, and it has caused screams of anguish from senior professors who can no longer easily obtain offers elsewhere, which they can use as levers to get their salaries raised. 4. Where new occupational needs arise, they can be filled more easily if there are more youths who might learn these occupations. Hence, population growth facilitates adjustments in the sizes of industries and in occupational structure. 5. When the total economy is growing relatively fast, savings can more easily be found for new investments without having to shift investment out of old capital. This is the physical counterpart to the human capital phenomena discussed in points 1 and 2 above. 6. Investment is less risky when population is growing more rapidly. If housing is overbuilt or excess capacity is created in an industry, a growing population will take up the slack and remedy the error, whereas without population growth, there is no source of remedy for the miscalculation. Hence, a growing population makes expansion investment and new entrepreneurial ventures more attractive by reducing risk, as well as by increasing total demand, of course. A faster growing population also increases the internal mobility of the labor force. The greater mobility follows from a larger number of job opportunities and a larger number of people in the young age groups who tend to be more mobile. Internal mobility greatly enhances the efficient allocation of resources, that is, the best matching of people to jobs. As Kuznets wrote, we cannot exaggerate the importance of internal mobility and of the underlying conditions in the modern economy to allocate and channel human resources. But when population growth is declining, the economy can get stuck with a hard-to-adjust oversupply of people in various occupations. A more realistic model for MDCs, we have seen that population size and growth have a variety of economic effects, some negative and others positive. Economists worth their keep must take account of the size and importance of the relevant forces. Furthermore, if several influences operate concurrently, we must concern ourselves with the overall effect rather than with only a single effect of any one variable at a time. In such a case, we can obtain a satisfactory overall assessment only by constructing an integrated model of the economy and then comparing the incomes produced under various conditions of population growth. When building such a dynamic model, we must compromise between the greater complexity of a more realistic model and the greater distortion of a more abstract one. Furthermore, different models are required for countries with different economic and demographic conditions. More specifically, we must have separate models for MDCs and LDCs. The model that follows is for MDCs. A model for LDCs is presented in the next chapter. Whether mathematical or verbal, simple or complex, computerized or not, earlier models of the effect of additional people on the standard of living in MDCs, including those from Malthus to the limits to growth, share the common root of first edition Malthus. Adding people who must work and live with the original fixed supply of land and capital implies less income for each person. If, however, we add to the simple Malthusian model another fundamental fact of economic growth, the increase in productivity due to additional people's inventive and adaptive capacities, we arrive at a very different result. The analysis whose results are presented below does just that. This model is outlined in Figure 33.2, where the elements of the usual neo-Malthusian model for MDCs are shown in solid lines, and where the novel knowledge creation elements are shown in dotted lines. That is, this model embodies not only the standard capital dilution effects, but also the contribution of additional people to technological advance through the creation of knowledge and through economies of larger scale. The latter elements have been omitted from population models in the past, but they are crucial to a balanced understanding of the problem. Three factors may be seen as acting upon the creation of new technological knowledge. 1. The total number of persons in the labor force, or in research and development, who may produce valuable improvements. 2. The total production in a year, the gross national income, with which improvements may be financed. And 3. The per capita income level, which influences the average amount of education a worker receives and hence affects the individual's capacities to make technological discoveries. The time horizon is roughly 50 to 150 years, short enough to rule out major changes in the natural resources situation. But it is sufficiently long so that the delayed effects of knowledge are believed to play their role. Though the model refers to the US, it is more appropriate to think of this analysis as applying to the developed world as a whole, because the MDCs are scientifically and technologically interdependent. This wider point of view skirts the possibility that one country might ride on the coattails of technological advance created by other countries, which cannot be done well anyway. You may feel uneasy with the lack of precision in the analysis of how population size and growth affect the creation of new technological knowledge, as discussed in Chapter 26. But to simply leave out the effect altogether is to implicitly and unreasonably estimate that the effect is zero, which is what the earlier models do. Certainly, the effect of population size on knowledge is greater than zero. Where else but from people's minds, past and present, can advances in knowledge come from? Physical capital alone cannot generate ideas. Perhaps in the future computers might, though physical capital does enhance learning by doing. To put it differently, additional workers certainly are not the only cause of increased productivity, but over any period longer than the business cycle, the size of the labor force is a major influence upon total output. And if we hold constant the stock of physical capital and the original level of technological practice, then population size is the only remaining influence upon total output. Hence, the appropriate argument is about how to estimate this factor, and which estimates to use, rather than whether to include it at all. This model does not treat human beings only as human capital, a commodity essentially plastic and inert like physical capital. Rather, it treats people as people, responding to their economic needs with physical and mental efforts and the creative spark. Imagination and creativity are not concepts commonly included in economic models, nor are they ever above the surface even here. But let us recognize their importance unselfconsciously and be willing to give them their due. The model's projections, streams of income per worker, were compared for a wide variety of population growth structures, including both one-time increases in population size and different rates of population growth, such as 0, 1%, and 2% yearly. And the comparisons were made under a variety of economic assumptions about savings rates and about the ways that additional people and various income levels affect changes in productivity. The most important result is that, under every set of conditions, demographic structures with more rapid population growth come to have higher per-worker income than less rapid population growth structures within 30 to 80 years after the birth of the additional child. Most often this happens after about 35 years, that is, about 15 years after the additional person enters the labor force. See Figure 33-3. It is true that 30 to 80 years is a long way off, and therefore may seem less important than the shorter run. But we should remember that our long run will be someone else's short run, just as our short run was someone else's long run. Some measure of unselfishness should impel us to keep this in mind as we make our decisions about population policy. And it may help to know that the short-run cost differences between the various demographic structures are small by any absolute measure, and also small relative to other variables that are subject to governmental policies. For purposes of population policy, however, we can reduce the comparisons of the different population growth structures to a simple form, the trade-off between present and future consumption. This simple trade-off applies to population change just as to such long-lived social projects as dams and environmental changes. That is, a key issue in any overall judgment about population growth is the relative importance we attach to consuming something now versus saving and investing part of it so as to consume even more later on, a major theme of the book. The effect of additional children upon the standard of living, putting aside the pleasure that children give to their parents, is undoubtedly negative in the short run. In the years while children consume but do not produce, additional children mean less food and less education for each person, or additional effort on the part of the parental generation to fulfill the needs of the additional children. During this early period, then, children are an investment. Their effect upon the standard of living is negative. And if attention is confined to this early period, then additional children count as a negative economic force. But if, on the other hand, we give weight to the more distant future, then the overall effect of the additional children may be positive. The positive effects will last much longer than the negative effects, indefinitely, in fact, and hence can outweigh the short-run effects, even though it is natural to care less about a given period of time in the far future than about an equal period beginning now. The device used by economists to summarize this stream of future effects is the discount rate. A low discount rate indicates that one gives relatively more weight to the future than does a high discount rate, though a future benefit or cost always gets somewhat less weight than a present benefit or cost. The futurity discount is very similar in concept to an interest rate, and the choice of appropriate discount rate is similar to the decision about the rate of interest one would be willing to accept in borrowing or lending money. If, for example, we set a discount rate of 5% per year, we mean that, for every year longer we have to wait for a payoff, we require the payoff to be at least 5% more than the amount we invested the year before, or else we would not make the investment. If we invest $1 now, we would require $1.05 a year from now. If investing does not look that promising, we would rather spend our dollar now than forego a dollar's worth of consumption until later. If we expect more than $1.05 back, the deal seems worthwhile if the appropriate discount rate is 5%. The model finds that even up to substantial rates of discount, at least 5%, to be contrasted with the real inflation-adjusted discount rate of 2 to 3% that seems to prevail in Western society over the long run, faster population growth has a higher present value than slower population growth. That is, social investment in population growth would be far more profitable than marginal social investments of other kinds. This finding may be contrasted with the standard conclusion that a lower rate of population growth is better at all rates of discount. You might check the conclusions drawn from this model with your intuition about whether all the people in the U.S. would be better off today if there had been half as many people in 1800 or 1850 or 1900 or 1950 as there actually were. It is plain that our ancestors bestowed benefits upon us through the knowledge they created and the economies of scale they left us. And if there had been fewer of those ancestors, the legacy would have been smaller. It is worth keeping this in mind when speculating about whether life today and in the future would be better if there were fewer people alive today. Population models, such as the one presented here, were not accepted before the 1980s because of the preeminence of physical capital in the thinking of economists then. But there has been recognition in recent years of the fundamental importance of knowledge, education, and the quality of the labor force in the productive process. The empirical studies that show the absence of a negative effect of population growth on economic development also have affected the thinking of economists. As a result, the sort of model described here, allowing for the contribution of additional people to technology and human capital, is much more congenial to economists than at the time of the first edition of this book. Despite the prevailing attitude against population growth, there never has been any scientifically valid evidence that population growth has a negative effect on the standard of living. The President's Commission on Population Growth and the American Future of the early 1970s sought hard to find such evidence. The Commission's creators clearly hoped and expected that it would bring in a report that called strongly for fertility reduction. Indeed, as then-President Nixon put it in a message to Congress, population growth is a world problem which no country can ignore. But despite its antinatalist origin, the worst the Commission could say was, "We have looked for and have not found any convincing economic argument for continued national population growth." It is also interesting to note the changes in views of the economists on that commission. Alan Kelly was responsible for the Central Review paper on economic aspects of population change, and Richard Easterlin had the task of evaluating Kelly's study. This was the evolution of their views, as described by Easterlin. It is instructive, I think, to note Kelly's own statement on the change in his views as a result of this research. Whereas he started out in the expectation that an antinatal government policy was justifiable on economic and ecological grounds, he ended up in a much more neutral position. In this respect, Kelly's experience is representative, I think, of that of many of us who have tried to look into the arguments and evidence about the population problem. Many people in the US and Europe, school administrators, university teachers, Social Security planners, and publishing houses, for example, have by now seen the face of zero population growth, and many have not liked what they have seen. Slower population growth and diminished demand have not brought the expected benefits, especially in education. By 1980, the lower schools were suffering from diminished enrollment. Instead of school systems feeling flush with resources in times of declining enrollments, a newspaper story headlined "Empty Desk Blues" told of increasing budget problems in the schools despite the declining demand. And at the time of writing in 1992, the universities are complaining of shrinking classes and diminished pools of talent, even so few students that they must close. Indicators of serious trouble, complained a newspaper that for long has asked for lower population growth. The editorial even complains that the situation is making students jumpier than before. Low population growth brings a cut in real salaries for many, and a lack of the excitement that growth usually brings for all. In the 1960s, Singapore gave people financial incentives to have fewer children. But after observing the results, Singapore turned completely around in the 1980s and gave incentives, though only to the middle class, to have more children. There are other reasons, too, for budget problems in schools. School systems in the U.S. face both rising costs and voter opposition to higher tax rates. Nevertheless, it is illogical and ironic that less demographic pressure should be associated with worsened budget squeezes in the schools. In contrast, when enrollments grow, communities somehow have found the way to support education well. Witness the unprecedented and huge influx of ex-servicemen into U.S. colleges after World War II. Adam Smith had it right. The progressive state is in reality the cheerful and the hearty state to all the different orders of the society. The stationary is dull, the declining melancholy, at the cost of the poorer countries. Does the increase in the MDC standard of living as a result of population growth come at the expense of the poorer countries? Many assert that a country is overpopulated if it is not self-sufficient in food and other raw materials, and then leap to the judgment that poor countries are thereby being exploited. Consider these paragraphs, for example, by Paul Ehrlich. Few Europeans seem to realize that they must draw heavily on the rest of the world for the resources necessary to maintain their affluence. Few also seem to realize that, with a few exceptions, European nations could not feed themselves without importing food or fertilizer or the petroleum to run farm machinery, etc. Even an island nation like Great Britain seems relatively oblivious to her extreme degree of overpopulation. The fact of Great Britain's almost total dependence on the rest of the world is only dimly perceived, and the continuance of today's world trade system is simply taken for granted. But Ehrlich himself, in his sort of rhetoric, fails to realize that exchange is a fundamental and necessary element of human civilization, and that it is quite misleading to think of one trade partner supporting another. Saudi Arabia no more supports the Netherlands by exporting oil than the Netherlands supports Saudi Arabia by exporting electronic goods. If you are a white-collar worker, you support a farmer with what you produce just as much as the farmer supports you. To divide the exchange in half and call one direction supportive and the other exploitive can only be misleading. Any attempt to make each of us self-sufficient pushes us back toward the short, sickly, hungry, impoverished life of subsistence agriculture. Yet another misleading idea underlies the belief that the so-called dependence of densely settled on sparsely settled areas is a sign of overpopulation. This view implicitly assumes that national borders are the only ones that matter. If one is thinking of war, that certainly is true. But in the peacetime that I assume we are discussing, Chicago is at least as dependent on downstate Illinois for soybeans as is Tokyo. Yet no one thinks that Chicago is overpopulated because it is not self-sufficient in soybeans. To make the sort of distinction Ehrlich makes between the US and Japan, to call the latter overpopulated because it gets its soybeans from abroad, is an archaic nationalistic theory of economics called mercantilism, a theory that was demolished by Adam Smith in 1776. The more general charge that MDCs exploit the LDCs and rape them of the resources that they should be saving for their own use was dispatched in Chapter 28. The earlier and still popular models of population growth's effects in MDCs, all founded on the Malthusian idea of diminishing returns, are directly contradicted by the empirical data. These models say that adding more people causes a lower standard of living. The data show no such thing. This chapter describes a theoretical population model that is more consistent with the facts. The increases in productivity that result from the larger scale of industry and from the additional knowledge contributed by additional people are here added to a simple economic model of a more developed country. The model works with a range of assumptions that I trust are realistic. The results indicate that developed countries with faster rates of population growth initially fall behind in per capita income, but only very slightly. Later, they do better than those with lower rates of population growth, usually in 30 to 80 years. That is, for the first 30 to 80 years after the birth of an additional child, 35 years is perhaps the most common period in the models, per capita income is very slightly lower because of the additional child. But after that period, per capita income is higher with the additional child, and the advantage of the faster population growth comes to be very considerable. Thus, though an increment of population initially has a small negative effect upon economic welfare, after a few decades, the effect becomes positive and large. Most telling of all, but hard to tell non-technically, computations that combine the longer-term and the shorter-term population effects in a standard present value framework of investment analysis indicate that even at costs of capital that are quite high relative to the social cost of capital, faster population growth has a higher present value than does slower population growth in almost all model variations. That is, higher population growth in MDCs is an attractive social investment as compared with other social investment possibilities. To achieve a reasonable understanding of the effects of population growth, we must extend our horizon beyond the near-term years and weigh together the effects of the long run and the short run. When this is done, population growth in the MDC world is seen to be beneficial rather than being the burden it appears to be in earlier Malthusian models which have only a short-run perspective. Afternote 1. William Shakespeare, Procreation and the Economics of Development. In the span of 14 lines, and however long it took to write them, William Shakespeare arrived at the heart of the demographic economic vision for which moderns such as I have had to struggle long and hard, and which is embodied in this chapter. Of course, it may be romantic, contrary to fact, and even counterproductive to think that Shakespeare arrived at this vision in a blinding flash. Perhaps he, too, struggled for it through many years before he compressed it into a few rhymes. But without doubt, he got there without the help of the great predecessors who built the steps and lighted the way for us moderns, and without the data collected over 2 centuries that now provide the substrate for the idea. Of course, Shakespeare's Sonnet 1 does not comprise a theory of the human enterprise's demographic economic development. Yet, the sonnet takes up themes and expresses a vision uncannily parallel to the present theory of that subject. My aim here is to use the sonnet to illuminate that theory, to see the theory more clearly, and show it to be more persuasive than it might otherwise appear. The good that Shakespeare wishes to advance is poetic truth, indistinguishable from beauty. This is the parallel to the natural resources and standard of living which are the subject of contemporary study of economic development. More about this shortly. Let us examine Sonnet L. That number may be more than a coincidence, just as it is not a coincidence that Genesis comes at the beginning of the Bible. Sonnet 1. From fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die, but as the riper should by time decease, his tender air might bear his memory. But thou contracted to thine own bright eyes, feed'st thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel, making a famine where abundance lies, thyself thy foe to thy sweet self too cruel. Thou that art now the world's fresh ornament, and only herald to the gaudy spring, within thine own bud buryest thy content, and tender churl makest waste in niggarding. Pity the world, or else this glutton be, to eat the world's due, by the grave and thee. Shakespeare begins by assuming that from fairest creatures we desire increase. That is, that there should be more of such creatures. By creatures, Shakespeare means people, our human species. That Shakespeare has such a demographic-like process in mind is clear from his third and fourth lines, death preceded by birth and renewal. And we may suppose that Shakespeare is interested in the human race as a whole, not only in its most beautiful specimens. In The Tempest, VI, we read, "How beauteous mankind is." If Shakespeare is indeed talking about people, as if humans have a place different than other creatures in the scheme of things, the sonnet immediately takes its leave of those in our society today who believe that other species have rights too. See chapter 39. These persons assert that when there is a conflict or trade-off between the increase of people and the increase of other species, the former must be constrained for the sake of the latter. These thoughts do not square with Shakespeare's ordering of the species. The sonnet's first line suggests that Shakespeare desires increase in the number of fair creatures for their own sake, just as many people look with satisfaction upon a populous, prosperous community. This sets him apart from many people in our age, for whom the increase of the human population is not a value in itself. I do not suggest that Shakespeare was calling for an indiscriminate increase in people. Indeed, he mentions only the fairest, which we might interpret as the most talented. But perhaps if asked, Shakespeare would have agreed that talent is spread widely, and that most people create a bit more than they use or destroy. And perhaps he would also have agreed that because it is difficult to predict where the bud of talent may sprout, he himself being a most powerful example, the best way to increase the number of the fair is to increase the total number of people. In his second line, Shakespeare gives us yet another reason for desiring increase, survival of humankind. Many persons today consider this idea primitive and logically unwarranted. Rather, the stabilization and zero growth of the population is seen as a value. Even for many among those who care about survival of humankind, survival of the race as a whole is subordinate to increase of their own ethnic or religious subgroup. And this preference is often sentimental, rather than a matter of seeking larger numbers to help them prevail in political conflict. In contrast, Shakespeare's only special pleading is in favor of people who are beautiful and creative. Let us turn now to Shakespeare's description of the mechanism of the advance of civilization, the most remarkable aspect of this sonnet. For Shakespeare, progress rather than just stability is within our powers and possibilities. This is implicit when he writes of increase and abundance, rather than merely maintenance and subsistence. Here is no pinched and dismal Malthusian vision of humanity's place on the globe, but rather an expansive and optimistic outlook of human dominion. But then Shakespeare warns that we humans may forego our opportunities by narcissistic preoccupation with our own luxurious living, by taking from the common pot of humanity without putting back into it. Contracted to thine own bright eyes, Shakespeare tells us, humanity can make a famine where abundance lies by feeding our own light's flame with self-substantial fuel. That is, we can fail to employ our capital, the true nature of which is the human drive to create and improve and advance. Instead, humanity may devote its energies to consumption and self-satisfaction, thereby burying within one's own bud our content. I was taken aback by the combination of beauty and understanding of life with which these few lines are suffused. The lines surpass in both respects other writings on the subject, scientific and artistic. Here we must pause to discuss the nature of the good that might either be created in abundance or be made so scarce as to cause a famine. Shakespeare certainly did not envision a process of economic development, such as engages contemporary analysis of the subject, wherein we wish to increase the supply of consumer and investment goods, as well as natural resources, in order to live longer and better. Rather, Shakespeare cared about the world's stock of poetic truths, such as he struggled to give us. And poetic truth is of course interrelated with, perhaps is identical to, the aesthetic aspect of life, which Shakespeare calls beauty, and which may be physical or artistic or spiritual. G. Wilson Knight argues forcefully that in the sonnets there is an interpenetration of the ideas of time, both past and future, material beauty, poetry, immortality, truth, nature, and art. A key idea is that the immortal substance of poetic beauty is distilled from the mere show of human beauty, a liquid prisoner pent in walls of glass, sonnets 5-6. This transmutation of physical beauty into poetic truth provides the best of reasons for Shakespeare to write poems about a particular beautiful young man. And indeed, Knight writes that, "The poet knows well that his poetry is more than his ordinary self. It is the very part was consecrate to thee. His own spirit, the better part of me, to be contrasted with the element of earth, which is the dregs of life, bound for death," sonnet 74. This better part is a refined state of being, like the refinement of distilled essences. From an economic point of view, the good that we may call truth and beauty is conceptually no different than raw materials such as grain, or processed goods such as services and manufactured products. As information and knowledge constitute an ever larger part of our economy with every passing year, and tangible goods, especially natural resource materials, including energy, become an ever smaller share of inputs, there should be less and less difficulty in agreeing that truth and beauty, call it art if you like, is a good which may be construed theoretically in ways similar to the ways we construe other economic goods. A key respect in which truth and beauty is like knowledge, and thereby like the supply of natural resources that flows from knowledge, is that our stocks of both sorts of intellectual goods are not depleted by use, but instead continue forever to enhance human life. Then Shakespeare proceeds to tell us that we may waste our chances, not only by gluttony and self-devotion, but also by attending to conservation rather than creation. He tells us that a society makes waste by niggarding. This is a striking vision of the nature of civilization. It may be seen as parallel to the following sequence. Increase in population size and rise in the standard of living force upon us new problems. These emerging problems lead to the search for solutions, though great developments may also arise in a more spontaneous fashion. And the solutions arrived at leave us better off materially and perhaps with more efficient social organizations than if the problems had never arisen in the first place. Hence, we need our problems because eventually we benefit from them. The resonance of the sonnet suggests that Shakespeare would have been sympathetic to this process. He would have felt at home, I think, with the notion that humanity not only needs to have problems solved, but also needs to impose bigger and better problems upon ourselves as a challenge to our creative powers, for the benefit of the human spirit as well as for the eventual benefit of our descendants. So I say with Shakespeare, pity the world, or else this glutton be, to eat the world's due by the grave and thee. It is interesting to contrast Shakespeare's view of the course of civilization and productive economy with that of Bernard Mandeville, who lived not much later. Mandeville also expressed himself in rhyme, but he clearly was a social scientist by inspiration rather than a poet. See the lengthy prose notes following the short rhyming pages of the Fable of the Bees. Mandeville saw improvement and advance as inevitable, brought about by the same selfish qualities that Shakespeare lamented, qualities which Mandeville might also not have admired or enjoyed, but nevertheless saw as a constant element in human nature. And Shakespeare referred, King Henry V, Act 1, Scene 2, to the same mysterious phenomenon of social organization and spontaneous cooperation among insects that Mandeville described in the fable of the bees. It may already have been a common insight in English culture by them. It is pleasant to imagine a meeting of the two men, each describing his vision, and with the other instantly seeing the point and joining the other's vision to his own in a grand amalgamation. After 2, how immigrants affect our standard of living. Immigration, illegal and legal, has touched a sore spot in American public opinion for 150 years and more. The reasons opponents of immigration give are mostly economic: jobs, welfare, and housing. But in fact, American citizens can do well while doing good by admitting refugees. Rather than being a matter of charity, we can expect our incomes to be higher rather than lower in future years if we admit more Cubans, Haitians, Indo-Chinese, Mexicans, Italians, Filipinos, and other ethnic immigrants. The first edition discussed the economic effects of immigration, but since then, I have written an entire book on this subject, and it no longer makes sense to tackle the subject here in brief. Instead, here is a thumbnail summary. Immigrants pay much more in taxes than the cost of the welfare services and schooling that they use. In fact, the average immigrant family uses less welfare services and pays more taxes than the average native family. This is because immigrants are not old, tired, and without skills. Rather, they are on average in the early prime of their work lives. And they are about as well educated as the native labor force, with a much larger proportion of professional and technical persons, such as doctors and engineers. Immigrants directly raise productivity with the new scientific and technical ideas that they invent. They also improve productivity indirectly by way of their earnings, which when spent increase the overall volume of goods and services produced, which in turn causes industries throughout the economy to learn how to produce more efficiently. Immigrants have no observable negative effect upon unemployment. Many recent studies agree. This is mainly because they not only take jobs, but with their earnings, which they then spend, they make as many jobs as they take. Furthermore, they make additional new jobs with the new businesses that they open. Immigration promotes progress toward all of the U.S. national goals at once: a stronger economy, heightened productivity, increased international competitiveness, better international relations.